welcome everyone to the University of Arizona Museum of Art. I am Olivia Miller, Director of the museum, and it is my delight to welcome you all to tonight to the lecture, What Did Goya See?, presented by Dr. Andrew Schulz, who's Vice President for the Arts and Dean of the College of Fine Arts. I would like to thank our members for joining us this evening. Your support of the museum is greatly, greatly appreciated. And just a couple of housekeeping things. One is if you could please silence your cell phones and take a moment to do that. The next is that this lecture will be followed by a print viewing of Goya prints from the museum's collection. So they're all set up in this adjacent gallery. I want to stress that this is a really, really special opportunity. You know, we've pulled these artworks out of storage, especially for this evening. With that said, they are set up on easels, and so I just ask that you're very mindful of moving throughout the space, being mindful of the feet of the easels projecting out, and if you could please not touch the works so that we can avoid any damage to the artwork. We are honored to be co-presenting tonight's lecture with the Art History program in the School of Art. And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Irene Romano, Professor and Chair of Art History and co-director of the Graduate Certificate Program in Museum Studies in the School of Art. And she will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Olivia. First, I want to thank Olivia and the UAMA staff for this collaboration tonight, and also for all that this incredible staff does to assist the School of Art, especially the Art History program, in allowing students to come over and doing internships. And it's just that we couldn't have a great program without the University of Arizona Museum of Art. So it is customary to say about a local celebrity that the speaker needs no introduction. But in this case, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Andy Schulz, not as the Vice President for the Arts or the Dean of the College of Fine Arts, but as a professor of art history in our program and an eminent scholar of the art of Francisco Goya and the Spanish Enlightenment. Professor Schulz received his BA with high honors in art history from Dartmouth College and his MA and PhD degrees in art history from Columbia University. His primary area of expertise, as I said, is Goya and the art and culture of the Spanish Enlightenment of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Dr. Schulz's 2005 book, Goya's Caprichos, Aesthetics, Perception, and the Body, published by Cambridge University Press, is about Goya's prints, 1797-98, and is a seminal text on the subject and was the winner of the 2007 Eleanor Tufts Award by the Society for Iberian Global Art. During his 15 years of heavy loads of academic administration, from 2009 to 2012 as head of art history at the University of Oregon, from 2013 his appointment as associate dean for research at Penn State University, and his appointment here in 2018 as dean of the College of Fine Arts, and then from 2019 as VP for the Arts. Somehow, Dr. Schulz has continued to maintain a high scholarly profile with peer-reviewed articles in major international journals, essays and edited volumes, and exhibition catalogs. Topics of these papers include the Prado Museum and Spanish nationalism, porcelains of the Moors, Moors in the bullfight, and court painters during the Enlightenment. He's a frequent contributor of professional conferences, including a recent presentation at the February College Art Association annual conference, and he's given numerous public lectures, with one scheduled on April 27th at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, where there's a Goya exhibition about to open. He has also maintained his professional engagement with the field of art history by, for example, serving on the board of the College Art Association and acting as a pre-publication peer reviewer for various presses. His latest book in preparation is Al-Andalus in the Age of Enlightenment, Islamic Art and Culture in the Spanish Imagination, under contract with Penn State Press. It focuses on the broader period of the Spanish Enlightenment and how the legacy of Islamic culture reveals itself in the spectrum of Spanish arts in the period from 1750 to 1820. Dr. Schulz's close examination of various state-sponsored art institutions reveals important findings about the influences of the Iberian Islamic age in the formation of Spanish national identity in the late 18th and early 19th century. He takes a broad look at the early modern period in Europe and at Spain in particular, and provides a corrective to the traditional understanding of this period, clarifying the place of Islam in European culture and its role in the construction of national identity through art and culture. It is a timely and important topic in our contemporary world. So on behalf of the Art History Program in the School of Art and UAMA, I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Schulz to answer the question he posed in the title of his lecture for this afternoon. What did Goya see during one of the most turbulent times in European history? Eddie.
Irene, thanks so much for that introduction. I'd forgotten I'd done most of that stuff, so it's good to be reminded. It's great to be, I'll say, back at the UAMA, because I actually gave a lecture here in 2008, long before I ever imagined coming here to work as a faculty member and an administrator. And that talk was on the subject of Goya's Caprichos, and I think it took place probably in this gallery. Olivia claims her mother attended, so I don't know. She probably has a good memory of it. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to be here. This might seem like a really idiotic title. What did Goya see? Of course, visual artists are professional lookers, and so it seems like such an obvious question in some ways, and yet there's some really interesting things to explore. The title is inspired by this print, which is captioned, "I saw it." And so that made me wonder, what is it? What did Goya see? Not only in this print, but more generally. And we'll find that in looking at some of his work, these questions actually are quite fascinating to examine. And from this initial question flow these two others that I've posed here. What did Goya see, and how did these experiences shape his art? And secondly, what did seeing, in fact, mean to Goya during this period and to his European contemporaries, especially his Romantic contemporaries? And this is all another way of thinking about what is the relationship between Goya and his art and the turbulent historical period in which he lived. And to begin to answer some of these questions, I'll begin with two of his most familiar works, ones that many of you will know and have seen, the 3rd of May, 1808, and Saturn Devouring His Son, around 1819, both in the Prado. And I'm beginning with a poetic way of thinking about this question with a quote from the poet Seamus Heaney, very famous Irish poet who's using Goya in this poem from 1969 to reflect on his own experience of the conflict in Northern Ireland during those years. You can see that, and James Heaney was in Madrid during this period. He was longing for home in a way, but also knowing that there were troubles in Ireland. And he encounters Goya in the Prado and sees Goya as a way of thinking about the conflicts of history. And so he says, this is the last 2 lines of this poem, he painted with his fists and elbows, flourished the stained cape of his heart as history charged. I think I spent a lot of time unpacking these beautiful lines. I'll return to them at the end of my talk as well. But the point I want to make in referencing them is the ways in which, to me anyway, there's no other historical artist who seems as present to us as Goya. One way I've thought about this in the past is to describe Goya as painting in the present tense. There's something about the way he works that both seems rooted in its historical moment and incredibly relevant to us. and as you'll find in the works I'm going to examine, sadly relevant, because I'm going to be focusing on this period of conflict, of war. You'll see images of warfare that involve the impact on civilians, that involve famine, issues that are only too relevant to our own historical moment in various contexts. So as we turn to Goya's times, I'm going to focus on the decade of the 1810s, which is a critical period for Goya. He's 64 years old. He's been through a series of health issues over the course of his life. He's deaf at this time, and he's living through this period that I'll talk about in a minute. But it's Goya's response to this, or its effect on him, is to generate this period for him of remarkable artistic creativity. This decade of the 1810s includes not only these 3 print series, but also the black paintings, of which the Saturn painting belongs, those massive historical paintings like the 3rd of May. And so it's really interesting to think about Goya's relationship to this time. My talk will revolve around this series of prints known as the Disasters of War, begun around 1810 and completed probably around 1815. I'll also refer to these other 2 print series that Goya made during the 1810s, the Tauromaquia, or the Art of the Bullfight, and also the Disparates. There are examples of all 3 of these series in the next gallery, as well as examples from the Caprichos, which were a series Goya made about a decade earlier in 1799 or so, and I'll talk about those a little bit as well. One of the things you'll find in my talk is I'm going to be examining some of the ways that Goya thought across media, and this is also very interesting to me. Not only is he thinking about what printmaking means and how to capture his experience of seeing in that medium, but there's this interrelationship between painting, drawing, and printmaking, which is, in some ways, I think, a little bit unique, but characteristic of some of his romantic contemporaries as well. And so drilling down a little further, I want to talk for a minute about the geopolitics of the 1810s. What is this world that Goya is seeing? There's a much longer history that we could talk about, but fundamentally we're talking about a long history of relations between France and Spain. And the impact of those relationships. The 18th century was characterized by very close relationships between France and Spain, largely because of the installation of the Bourbon dynasty as the kings of Spain. And so there was this family relationship between the kings of Spain, the kings of France, both members of the Bourbon family. The influence of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, which was very much rooted in French intellectual culture, had a really important life in Spain. But then there's this rupture, which begins with the French Revolution. And we could talk much more about that, but that period continues on with the Napoleonic invasion of Spain. And that's really the seminal event of this period, the so-called Peninsular War. That's the term for it in Spain. And involved not only Spain but also Portugal. The war began in 1808, concluded in 1814, and you see here just a couple of historical paintings meant to just illustrate for you a little bit some of the texture and context of this period. These are both very famous French painters of this period, great painters of Napoleonic victory and glory, and you see on the left the surrender of Madrid, a canvas made in 1810. It's an event that happened in 1808, so painting very much of Goya's time. And on the right, Napoleon's brother, Joseph, who he installed on the Spanish throne. And Joseph Bonaparte ruled Spain from 1808 to 1813, and you see him here of all the trappings of Spanish monarchy, including the castle and the lion, referring to Castile and Leon, the 2 main provinces of Spain. This period ended with the defeat of Napoleonic forces in 1814, and what that led to was, in fact, a repressive regime that was established following that. The king named Ferdinand VII came to rule, and so this whole decade, for the first half is warfare, the second half is political repression, and Goya is living within this context. And the entire period really is characterized by these tensions between the conservatism of the church and the aristocracy and liberalism and the values of Enlightenment. And there were many people who welcomed the French into Spain for that reason. They saw the French as, in a sense, modernizing Spain and bringing enlightened ideals. So one way of thinking about all of this broadly is this is really the birth of the modern world. The rise of nationalism, Spanish nationalism forges in this crucible, and as we'll see in a little while, also the birth of modern warfare. And so Goya is living at the cusp of this modern world. I just wanted to bring this painting back for just a minute, just to let you know this painting was made at the end of that conflict I described with Napoleon, about an event from the beginning of it. And so Goya here is in a sense memorializing and heroicizing these figures who had resisted the occupation of Madrid, who are here being assassinated by French troops. And we'll see Goya kind of thinking about this composition actually in a lot of the works I'm going to show you. You can almost think in musical terms, like something like theme and variation, where in the Disasters of War, Goya is playing around with this composition, trying to work it out, and ends up with this very memorable picture. Everything seems kind of locked in place and inevitable. I should also mention this is the first depiction of an execution by firing squad that I think exists in the history of art. So again, thinking about ways of, aspects of the modern world that begin here. This idea of a contemporary history painting, which is what Goya is doing here, is one that happens elsewhere, and we can think about this monumental work by, again, contemporary French artist, Andrew Schulz. These are both massive paintings. The Goya painting is about 9 by 12 feet. It was made as a public commission, meant to memorialize, the end of the conflict with Napoleon and to celebrate the heroism, especially of the Spanish populace. And we'll talk about this more in a minute as well. This is the beginning of guerrilla warfare, where there's this asymmetrical combat between an organized army and the population of a country. And so you see the figures who are being executed by these soldiers. Really, they're not in uniforms. They're not part of an organized military. But this idea of elevating historical events to the realm of history painting, again, is a characteristic feature of this moment, and Goya plays an important role in it. We could add William Turner to this roster of artists as well. So here you see, moving forward, here's one of those kind of variations I talked about. This is now one of the prints from the Disasters of War. I mentioned the 3rd of May is a very public statement. It was commissioned by the Council of the Regency, which prepared for the return of Ferdinand VII. At the end of the war, this kind of hopeful moment. Goya made it in some ways as a way of proving his kind of loyalty to the Spanish cause at a time when that was under question on the part of investigators who were examining the royal household. But going back to the beginning, most of Goya's work during this period of warfare was very private, and it really centers around prints and drawings, and especially this really remarkable series called The Disasters of War, which I want to spend some time unpacking and examining during the next part of this talk. And this is where some of this idea of what did Goya see comes into play, because Goya had firsthand experience of the Peninsular War. In the fall of 1808, as the French were occupying parts of Spain, Goya went to his home city, which was Saragossa, which you see Google has marked for us. You see Madrid in the very center of the map. So many people know it as the place where the train stops on the way to Barcelona, either to or from Madrid. Maybe you've gotten off the train. It's an interesting city. There's a lot of Goya stuff there. But in any event, Goya went to Saragossa. He was invited by a general who was leading the Spanish resistance to this invasion. And Goya actually talks about why he wanted to go to Saragossa and what he wanted to do there in a letter. And what he says to see and study the ruins of the city in order to paint the valiant deeds of her citizens. It's a request I cannot refuse, since the honor and glory of my homeland are so close to my heart. So there's this very strong initial patriotic impulse. He wants to go memorialize heroic deeds. He wants to memorialize the city. He kind of goes between the first and second stages of the French siege of the city. The French had tried to conquer Saragossa. There was a resistance. They released the siege. Goya went to visit, and then he leaves when the fighting returns. And eventually, of course, Saragossa falls, and something like 50,000 Spaniards died. in this time. So it's a really, it's gives you some sense of the scale. The city was left in ruins, as you see from this print, which was not made by Goya, but by other artists who were also in Zaragoza at this time. And one of the other ways in which this is really the birth of the modern world is the number of images and historic accounts of this war. There's this plethora of information. We have historical records. People like Lord Byron and many others were interested in Spain during this time and the Spanish cause, as some had been earlier in Greece. And so there's this kind of notion of that. So here you see a pair of artists, Juan Galvez and Fernando Brambilla. Galvez made paintings, Brambilla made prints after them, and you can see the character of this is very much about documenting a historic monument. It's named and thinking about, it's almost theatrical in the scale and the lighting. There are figures who give us a sense of scale. And so this is part of a series of 36 prints that was kind of an official project of the Spanish government. And these were published in a series of installments over time. And they, as I said, they document this first siege. They show events, damage, important personalities. Some are depicted at night. And so they're kind of documentary in that sort of way. Goya's reactions to these events are very different, and unfortunately we don't really have anything that he made during this first visit. There's no notebook that's been found or other kinds of records like that, but there are some small-scale works like this one, and sorry I'm showing this to you on such a small scale. It's a small painting made right around this time, 1808, 1810. Goya came back to Madrid in November of 1808, and sometime after that he began making the etchings that would be the disasters of war. And what's interesting, let's see, what do I want to do here? Sorry, I went the wrong way. Violet gave me directions and I already violated them. What's interesting, I'll just start with this here. What's interesting is you see immediately a difference. Goya focusing on the human figure and on kind of the human toll of warfare, rather than on the larger context of the urban fabric. And Goya also here, again, you see a little variation on that 3rd of May, is playing around with this idea of the soldiers on the right, the line of soldiers, and the fleeing civilians, and also Spanish resistors. He's also using references to religious iconography, which he'll do over and over again. And often historians have pointed to a relationship to the biblical story of the massacre of the innocents in this kind of small image. But Goya doesn't, this is one example of a painting from this period. It's really the only one. Goya was short of supplies. He actually had given canvas to the military cause, so he didn't have canvas to paint on, and so he turns to printmaking. And this is his first return to printmaking since 1799, so about 10 years since he's made prints. And again, you see the relationship I'm just suggesting between this print and the small painting. We'll come back to this image on the right several other times. It again refers to looking and seeing. One cannot look, but of course we are looking, so what does that mean? But the series of prints that he embarks on, he begins them around 1810, and some of them have the date 1810 on them, so we know that's the time he probably began the series. There are 80 prints in all in the first edition of the disasters, and not only was he short on materials like canvas, he didn't really have very good printmaking supplies either during this period. So when you look at the disasters, you'll see the plates are small. Oh, by the way, just for fun, I also brought these Dover editions, and this is a great, if you're interested in Goya's prints, this is a great way to kind of think about them more. Each of the series is in one of these books, and they're printed to scale. So you actually get a sense of how big things are. And so some of the later print series I'll look at are this big, and the disasters of war are this big. Like Regis had been this big. He also couldn't afford some of the same kinds of materials, and I can talk more about all of this if you're interested a little later. The other thing that's interesting is the order in which they were executed is not the final order of the series. And this is true of Goya's printmaking in general. He would experiment, make things, and then he would decide what order to put them in, often with the help of some of his friends. And that's where this volume comes in, this so-called Sean album, which is owned by an art historian, a contemporary of Goya's, named Juan Agustin Sean Bermudez, who helped Goya order and caption the images. And you can see here's the original. This is the original title page. This album is actually in the British Museum. It was passed on passed down and then eventually purchased by a very important curator of prints at the British Museum. And there's another volume, or it's actually disbound now, but the other set like this exists in the Norton Simon Museum, where I'll be speaking in a couple weeks. And the Norton Simon Museum has an extraordinary collection of Goya prints and an extraordinary exhibition that's about to go up. So if you happen to be in Southern California over the next several months, it's definitely worth paying a visit. They have just an incredible collection of things there. But what this volume establishes is the order of the series and the captions. And I'll show you some examples of this as we go along. And this album, Goya hand wrote the captions, which then end up being reproduced in the print. So this is a really, really remarkable object, still bound. And I love you can see the very tendentious nature of the title, the fatal consequences of the bloody war in Spain with Bonaparte and other emphatic caprices. In 85 prints, so this has more prints than in the final version, invented, drawn, and engraved by the original painter, Don Francisco Goya y Cifuentes. And Goya often identifies himself as a painter. He does this often, even in cases where he's making prints. So this is this really critical manuscript, probably from around maybe 1815. And here's the first edition. So the prints weren't actually published until 1863 by the Royal Academy in Madrid. And the plates had been in Goya's family, the etched plates. Goya had made about 500 or so working proofs during his lifetime, maybe to give to friends or to kind of experiment with. But the final edition isn't published until 1863 in this edition of 80 prints. Again, following the same order, using the same titles. And in fact, you can go to Madrid and see the plates in the Royal Academy. And at this time, as you'll see in a couple of examples, a kind of tone of aqua tint was added to the plates. And so the original plates have a very white, kind of spare quality, and then there's this kind of even tone of aqua tint applied, probably to cover up some damage that had occurred to the plates over the course of, 50 or 60 years in which they'd been stored in various places and probably deteriorated to some extent. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of the prints a little bit and show you what this is. It starts off with this image, which serves as kind of the frontispiece of the series, definitely etched later than some of the other works, shows this kneeling figure, clearly kind of a religious iconography to it. Originally it was thought that Goya probably reused a plate to make this one, because there's so much stuff in the background. And it kind of reminds one of images like this from the Caprichos, again, a decade earlier, where you see these figures kind of lurking in the background. And same thing, it's kind of going on up here in this area. But the religious context is kind of interesting. This is a painting Goya made at the end of the same decade called Agony in the Garden. This is a little sketch for a much larger image. And this is the idea here is it relates a little bit to the image of Christ, imploring God to release him from the suffering he knows lies ahead. And so that's what's going on here in a way in this frontispiece, is this presaging of all of these bad things that are about to happen, that you're about to see. And as the series progresses, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. That's what we have. And there really are three components to this print series of 80 prints. Plates 2 through 47 are images of warfare, and then there's a series of images of famine, and then finally those so-called emphatic caprices that Goya had alluded to in that title page I showed you a moment ago. And you can immediately see what's going on here is not depictions of major battles or recognizable figures, but rather anonymous incidents and encounters that are emblematic of the nature and character of the struggle, which is really about killing, rape, death, atrocity, suffering, and the suffering body appears over and over again. Again, Goya capturing the beginnings of modern warfare, French regulars against the Spanish civilians in this guerrilla war that had happened. And you can see, you can't see it super well, but you can see this handwritten captions that have now been engraved on these images. And the captions are really interesting in the case of this series. They're very simple, they're more expressive than descriptive, and they often refer to other prints or previous prints. Like in this case, you can see first one on the left is called With or Without Reason, and the next image in this series is called The Same. And Goya is often doing this, calling our attention to these relationships between the images. The other thing that is remarkable about this, especially in relationship to that very patriotic title page, is there are no heroes. Again, in an image that looks a little bit like the 3rd of May, French soldiers attacking Spanish civilians, but on the right-hand side, the tables have been turned, and this Spaniard is wielding an axe against a French soldier. And so it's this universalizing of this experience rather than a taking of sides, if you will. So I'm going to continue a little bit with the same kind of progression. There are lots of images of women. These are also very interesting, and again, in some cases are heroic, but in some cases image scenes of brutality. I think one of the plates in the gallery shows a woman being kind of cornered or threatened by a French soldier, and so that's another theme in the series throughout in various ways is images of women. You'll see that in a second as well. In fact, in this next image, this is perhaps the only image that refers to an actual historical event, historical figure, and this is a figure who was known as Agustina of Aragon, or the Maid of Saragossa, and she was memorialized over and over again in contemporary prints and contemporary writing. And you see, this is again Galvez and Bramila, the same pair that I showed you that bombed out the hospital of. This is their image of Agustina, which you can see, it's very much about her identity. It's about telling the story, and the story was she was bringing food to the front lines, and all the soldiers were dead. And so she climbs over the bodies and fires the cannon herself. And so I think what Goya is relying, on the viewer's familiarity with the figure in the way he shows her in this more anonymous pose. And in fact, I think Goya is thinking about Galvez and Bramila, not that image, but in a painting, another painting, an alternative image that Galvez made, and just the relationship of that hill, which tells us where we are in this neighborhood called Portillo in the city of Saragossa. It's so similar to what you have in the image by Galvez, which I think is kind of fascinating. So we've seen some images of fighting, and here's the result of all that fighting. The fatal consequences, death and atrocity. Isn't this fun to listen to at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon? And again, the interrelation of images, the one on the right, which is sequentially after the one on the left, the same thing elsewhere, so this kind of no escape from this, and in the landscapes themselves, this repetition of form, so you'll see a pile of bodies, and you look in the distance, there's another one as well. But these are really remarkable images, and it's hard to understand from our perspective looking back just how revolutionary these would have seemed at the time. Because Goya is violating just about every compositional convention you could imagine. And there's this very strong rhetoric of realism. We believe that we in fact are seeing what the artist saw because of this kind of accidental quality, this kind of these unplanned compositions, these piles of figures. The one on the left has a date, 1810. It's one of those early prints, and it's also one of the working proofs I mentioned. You can see it doesn't have that same plate tone that is added later. You can see it's a proof that's in the Museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. One of the interesting ways we could talk about this as well, I'm not going to here, is in relationship to photography and the beginnings of photography as a medium to represent war during exactly the same period. And one theory about the plate tone is that it also replicates in some way, the effect of photography. And so you can think about, Roger Fenton or photographers of the American Civil War, really working during this same period that the first edition was published, 1860s. Anyway, that's been explored, and it's an interesting topic. Thinking across media, it's also fascinating to look at Goya's still life paintings from this period. And this is really the only time Goya makes still life paintings in his entire career. And there are 12 of them. They remain in his studio. We don't know if they were intended ever to be sold, but they have a very strongly observed quality. They depict hunted or butchered animals. Goya himself loved hunting and depicted hunting often, but here there's this inescapable relationship in the way, in this case, these fish are sort of stacked unceremoniously, as opposed to what still life usually is, which is this careful arrangement of form. To me, it's inescapable to think about these same relationships with each other in Goya and thinking through various means about the experiences he's having. And this is a beautiful painting. It was acquired by the Houston Museum of Fine Arts not long ago. It's very sharply lit, has these hauntingly open eyes of the fish, and again, these are interesting paintings to look at as a series. Another way to think about what Goya is doing here is in relationship to classical art. I mentioned religious art earlier, and this is a painting by Giuseppe de Ribera, a very important Spanish painter. This composition existed in several versions, one of which is in the Royal Collection. I'm not suggesting that Goya is consciously thinking about this, but there is some interesting similarity between, on the one hand, Goya's image, which shows these soldiers pulling the clothes off of these dead figures, and the figure of Apollo, who is removing the skin from Marsyas. That's the story. It's called The Flaying of Marsyas. And Marsyas had challenged Apollo to a musical contest. Of course, he lost, and his punishment was to be, tortured in this way. But there's this interesting similarity, and in some ways, all art is about art, and Goya is thinking in that way here as well. So now I want to finally get to that painting, or that print that I started with, and to really think about it a little bit now that we have some context surrounding it. And it's a really interesting print in the series. I'm showing it here. This is from that Sean album in the British Museum on the left with a handwritten title. And you see the image on the right from the first edition with that plate tone we've been talking about, and I'll just put it up on full screen for a minute. It shows figures moving through a hilly landscape, and in this case, the depiction is not of dead or wounded, but rather of the displaced population, what we call refugees. It was interesting. I kind of assumed refugee was a more modern word than it turns out to be. I looked it up, and it actually refers to Protestants who fled France after the Edict of Nantes in 1685 during this period of religious persecution. And this refuge, I think, is the word that means kind of like sanctuary or place of safety. And so again, modern ideas about warfare, the idea of a displaced population as a subject of depiction, the effects of war on the population. And this to me is one of the most beautiful compositions, if we can talk about beauty at the same time. You have these two pairs of figures, these two men at the left. One is kind of rooted in place, pointing with a look of horror as the other attempts to pull him away toward the left edge of the image. We also have this mother and child who are kind of in poses that counterbalance those two men, echo their gestures, the child crying. And so there's this incredible kind of contrasting set of angles, rhyming poses, and also contrast between black and white, and the way Goya is using black and white to really create this sense of emotion and evocation in this image, and the landscape that moves vertically from light to dark to light. This is also probably a fairly early image. It's signed in the lower left, and it's mostly created through etched line, but again, it's inserted into the middle of the composition. I'll just show you just an example so you have a sense of it. This is an example of the kind of drawings that Goya would make in preparation for these prints. And the drawing faces the same way as the print, because you take the drawing and you press it onto the etching plate, and then you make the etching, and then that reverses the image back to the way the original drawing is facing. And we can spend time comparing these two. It's interesting to look at the way Goya has, I think, strengthened and reinforce the power of the image in some of the choices that he makes in the final print versus the drawing. So what's interesting to me is who's doing the looking here, because you have an image that's about looking, that's about seeing, and it's about seeing what you can't see, because everyone's looking out of the frame. And so there are these echoing ideas of looking, and we realize in the print series that it's the artist who's looking, because the next one says, and this also. So it was the artist saw this, and he also saw this. But there's this doubling of witnessing that I think is so interesting, and other examples in other prints within scenes who are also witnesses. And what's I think especially powerful about Disaster 44, I saw it, is we don't know what the horror is. And this is also often true in these prints, that the conflict is off, the thread, if you will, is out of the frame, which only heightens it, because we can't understand it, we can't absorb it, we can only imagine it. And this again, I mentioned this print earlier several times. Also interesting in thinking about looking, one can't look, and yet we're called on to do just that, and to witness what we're seeing here, the suffering of these figures. I'm going to keep going, conscious of time a little bit. So looking is something, and seeing is something Goya had mentioned in some of his earlier art as well. This is a very small painting he made in the 1790s, where it's a small painting of a madhouse. It's in Dallas at the Meadows Museum of Spanish Art at SMU. And he wrote a letter describing this scene of these lunatics, or this madhouse. And the interesting part to me is he claims it's a scene I witnessed in Saragossa. So again, this idea of the artist seeing, the artist recording, the artist creating a sense of authenticity through claiming to have seen this image. He also does this here in this Inquisition scene. This is an example of a drawing that Goya made also during the same decade of the 1810s. I didn't put the date on it. I did, 1814 to 23, don't know exactly when it was made. But this refers to a particular woman who was accused because apparently she knew how to make mice. But notice he says, "I saw her," and he names her, and all of that is written actually on this. On the robe the woman is wearing. This is a traditional way the Inquisition would inscribe the crime onto the figure. And so this idea of seeing, of witnessing, of being present, of displaying what is seen is something that Goya does over and over again. And often he does it in retrospect or in memory. This is a scene he would have seen actually much earlier in his life than in this case. I mentioned also there are scenes of famine in the Disasters of War, and I'm just going to show these fairly quickly and move on. But again, what happened was there was a crop failure in Madrid in 1811, and so the fall through spring, 1811, 1812, was this incredible period of famine and suffering, and a whole series of these images depict, in general terms, the impact of those events. You see this, again, a mother and child, we saw that earlier on the left, and in this case, something else that we see over and over again is contrasting figures where there is kind of a rejection of sympathy, if you will. Like you see these figures over here, clearly aren't suffering, ignoring and bypassing the figures who are in the caption, kind of emphasizes this difference between the figures. The third component, and this will take us into some other print series, are these so-called emphatic caprices that Goya emphasized in that title that I showed you at the beginning. The final 15 images are, in a sense, a series within a series. They depart and head in a different direction. They're probably etched later, and they refer to that repressive regime I talked about that comes after the Peninsular War, the regime of Ferdinand the Seventh. And these are kind of fantastic scenes. They're filled with strange creatures. They're very enigmatic. They seem allegorical. They often seem kind of chaotic or repressive in a very general, or threatening in a very general sense. And I should just quickly mention, when Ferdinand came into power in 1815, he reinstated the Inquisition. He supported the clergy and the aristocracy, so kind of supported the old order, and revoked a constitution that had been written in the free part of Spain in 1812, which is really the first liberal democratic constitution. In all kinds of ways, it's really revolutionary. So Ferdinand came back, and these images may refer to his rule. They also refer back to earlier works Goya made, and so we constantly find Goya thinking about his own art. And this is a plate from the Capriccios. People often ask me, what work would you like to have if you could have one? It would be this one. It's one of the most beautifully rendered images in aquatint and etching, just the range of tonalities. And I also just love there's this beautiful, to me, quality to this work, these very strange and hideous figures kind of caring for each other, which I find like kind of touching in this interesting way, clipping their toenails as the one in the back protects them. But I think you can clearly see the relationship here. You can also see Goya had much better materials in 1799 than he did in 1814, 15. These images bring to mind kind of another notion of seeing, and that is a kind of visionary idea of what it means to see, kind of to see the unseen, to see the imaginary. And that, of course, is such an important part of Romanticism as well, and it's something that animates some of what Goya does after the disasters of war, not only in this series, but also in another one I'll touch on just very briefly right now, which is called first of all, I just want to show you a couple more of these emphatic caprices. A lot of them are critical of the clergy, of the church, this gluttonous monk who's sitting on the pot here, surrounded by masks and, church ornaments. And then this figure of a priest on this very tenuous tightrope. May the cord break. Originally in a working proof, there's a papal tiara on this figure, referring to the Pope at this time, Pius VII, but that was removed and the image is more generalized in this final work. These emphatic caprices very much relate to a series Goya began to work on around this time called the Disparates, which is the third of Goya's four-print series. And here you see just the obvious relationship between these two images. I'm not going to talk about these too much just because I want to begin to wrap up, but Goya made 22 images, didn't publish them during his lifetime, so just as with the disasters of war, these remained in his studio, they remained unpublished. They weren't published until 1864, again by the Royal Academy, just a year after they issued the disasters of war. They issued this series. These are on much bigger plates. This beautiful English copper that he was able to use here. And they were originally given the title of Proverbs. That's the title they were given in 1864. They were thought to illustrate Proverbs, and then we just didn't know what the Proverbs were. And actually one of the great Goya scholars found Proverbs that he thought matched up with each of the images, but then a series of working proofs were discovered, showed the print and a handwritten caption. And that caption was disparate something, so in this case, disparate puntual, or punctual folly, whatever that is. And the title itself relates to the mystery of these images, but they're now known as the Disparates. And here's another one. I'm just comparing it back to that earlier image from the disasters of war I showed you. Many of them show kind of the world upside down, kind of carnivalesque images. These remain very enigmatic and very hard to puzzle out. And so Goya here is turning from, if you will, the realism of the disasters of war toward a notion of fantasy, which he had been very interested in during the 1790s with the Capriccios. And so there's this kind of cycle in Goya's art between observation and vision in the sense of the fantastic and the unseen. That's all right. Just wrapping up the disasters of war end with two images that return to the religious iconography of the beginning. Plate 79 is called The Truth Has Died, and plate 80, which you see now on the right, is called Will She Rise Again? Unfortunately, the answer was no, historically, during this period, but that's the way the cookie crumbles, I guess. And in fact, when the conflict ended in 1814, Goya realized he couldn't publish this series. There would be no audience for the kinds of images that I've been showing you. And so what he does is he thinks, okay, I like to make prints, I don't have a lot of other materials, I have these nice new copper plates, I need some money, and so he decides to publish a print series on the bullfight, which is a very popular Spanish subject and is really becoming the Spanish national pastime during this period. But what's interesting about this is he's still thinking about violence, he's still thinking about suffering, and he's still really thinking about many of the same themes that had animated the disasters of war. So I'll just mention quickly as I move toward conclusion, he's 70 years old. It's kind of remarkable to think about the kind of the creativity and the drive of this figure. And he makes these 33 prints of the bullfight, which really are a history of the bullfight and at the same time a history of Spain. And I've written on this topic a little bit. It begins with the origin of fighting bulls in hunting, and that's what you see in the lower left, for ancient Iberians kind of hunting bulls. And then he claims that the Muslims who inhabited Spain played an integral role in turning the bullfight into an art, which is completely made up, but that's his claim. And so he integrates kind of the Muslim past into the history of Spain, and the image you see, the upper image, which is again a gloriously beautiful image, and the way light and dark play across this image, the way the bull and the figure on horseback are intertwined in this beautiful kind of dance, if you will. And then the lower image is a bullfighter from Goya's own day doing a kind of daring move that he was known for. And I just think these images work beautifully together with the kind of the repetition of the lance and the ways in which it's used in different ways. And you see this very beautiful sense of composition, the shadows. I mean, these are gloriously amazing images and show this incredibly inventive artist at work. Many of them also include onlookers, and again, that's interesting in terms of this idea of seeing and the way in which the bullfight is a spectacle that's meant to be watched and witnessed. Unfortunately, Goya failed commercially with this venture. They were too different from contemporary printmaking, and the freedom of line, the use of aquatint, kind of the formal elegance of these compositions just didn't resonate with his contemporaries, but the French Romantics loved these images, and these prints were integral to Goya's reputation in the 19th century. Figures like Théophile Gautier and others wrote very beautifully about Goya's depictions of the bullfight. I just want to show you one more of these. I'm going to use this image as a way of concluding my talk. This is probably the most daring and modern and innovative of these prints. And actually, there's an example of it in the gallery, which is great. So you can take a look at it in a minute. And one thing I didn't mention before is, rather than the very brief captions that you saw in the disasters of war, these images of the bullfight have these very long, I would call them titles rather than captions. And actually, they were published as a separate sheet. And so you see this image has the very long title, Unfortunate Events in the Front Rows of the Ring of Madrid and the Death of the Mayor of Torrejon. And so Goya here is referring to very specific events that happened in historical time. 1801 is when this mayor was killed in the Ring of Madrid accidentally. Goya didn't imagine the image this way originally. And here's another example of a preparatory drawing for one of the prints. And these, in this case, all of the drawings for the Tauromaquia are in red chalk. And you can see some of the kind of the chaos and the turbulence of the drawing. It brings to mind some of the ways the images in the disasters of war function. But you can see the bull and the dead figures are very much part of both images. In the drawing, you see the bullfighter also represented as kind of a shadowy figure above this massive of chaotic bodies. But notice how in the final print Goya completely comes up with a different idea and shows this kind of breakdown between the division that separates kind of spectacle and observer. The chaos created as this bull apparently, we understand in the image, kind of charged through the crowd and impaled this figure on its horns. And again, kind of the violence and the suffering of this figure brings to mind the disasters of war. And so I'm showing you this example, one of the brutal examples from the disasters of war, where this figure, whose arm has been cut off, is shown impaled on a tree. And if you could look closely enough, you would see that the branch of the tree actually pierces his back, just as the horn of the bull pierces the back of the figure in the ring. And I'll just quickly mention, some people have compared the image on the left to a very famous Roman sculpture called the Torso Belvedere. And again, thinking about Goya's depiction of the disasters of war as really an attack on the classical tradition, an attack on civilization, an attack on the body in this kind of amazing way. So there are many other connections we could draw, but I would argue that the violence and brutality of warfare is being displaced here onto the art of the bullfight, and so Goya is thinking allegorically about these same things. So what's interesting here also is Goya wrote a handwritten caption on this print, and it was, "I saw it." The same caption we saw on this disaster of war earlier. And there's this amazing set. It's fun that you can see it's from the Boston Public Library, which has this incredible set of the Tauromachia. And the captions are very much like the captions that were on the disasters of war. So Goya's original idea clearly was to continue that kind of expressive notion of captioning the images, and then he moved away from that. In this case, the idea of seeing is interesting because there's this figure lurking in the background who seems like some sort of witness to the scene. And here you see him here. And he bears some sort of resemblance to Goya himself. And so we might imagine this figure lurking in the background, Goya himself, this witness to history, bringing to mind the lines with which I began my talk. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. See if there are any questions here, and then we can informally.
Yes.
Okay, so happy to. I think we covered a lot of territory. It won't be a quiz. Hi, yeah, hi. Hey, Kevin. How are you?
The last one you showed the Tauromachia.
Yeah.
Any thoughts as to why, from the previous sketch to the final, why the bleachers were empty on the left-hand side?
Yeah, I don't really have a good answer for you, other than it creates a very dramatic kind of sense of terror as the figures presumably fled from that direction. But I don't really have a good answer, but it's an amazingly modern composition. Yeah.
Do you think the emptiness could be an allegory for the loss of life if it's meant to be an allegory for war?
Could be, yeah. Yeah, other questions? Hi.
They're obviously anti-war etchings, which are meant to be reproduced. He would have been in danger if he had published them in periodicals at the time?
I think he just thought people had lived through this. They probably didn't want to be reminded of it by looking at it after the fact.
Was he considered an enemy of the state in any way?
Goya?
Yeah.
So he, it's interesting. Goya kept a low profile during the war. He remained in Madrid. There's a quote, I was going to read a quote that I happen to have with me. It's interesting hearing a contemporary talk about Goya during the war. Goya was more than anything a political survivor. He lived through a whole series of regimes. But during this period, he worked for the French a little bit. It was kind of unavoidable. But his sympathies clearly lay, with us on the Spanish side. But here's one of his contemporaries said that Goya retreated to his home and studio to work on his paintings and engravings and stopped seeing most of the people he used to spend time with. And so he really, I think the studio for him was really a refuge. He actually tried to leave Spain in 1812, but the government threatened to confiscate his possessions, and so he returned and decided to remain. After the war, Goya and many other people came under suspicion, and in Goya's case, it had to do with a painting called the Naked Maja. Goya made a pair of paintings called Clothed and Naked Maja, and this painting of the Naked Maja was considered licentious, and so Goya was called before the Inquisition to answer to it, and we don't really know what happened, but he was cleared of any wrongdoing. But he, as a member of the royal household during the war, he had served the French in some way. He did some portraits occasionally and some other things like that. I mean, it's a little bit like Picasso being in Paris during World War II, remaining in the city and continuing to work on his art. Well, I'm happy to talk more informally. Oh, another question, yeah.
You said earlier in 1799 he had much better supplies. What happened? Because of the war?
The war, yeah, the war, yeah. Well, thank you very much for being here, and I look forward to talking further.